Okay, so I just wanted to make a very quick video explaining the workflow behind my new add-on. It essentially allows you to create extremely dense environments in a very efficient way without slowing down the viewport. And there are basically four main workflows for this add-on. The first one allows you to paint your foliage assets, or any object for that matter, on top of multiple surfaces at once. Number two, you can create your own procedural biomes that you can easily re-import and apply to large-scale scenes while maintaining the viewport performance. Number three, you can sculpt intricate objects by essentially drawing in 3D. And finally, number four, you can procedurally model very complex architectures, which means that you can customize and change the entire structure even at the end of the process. Let's start from the basics. There's basically only one shortcut that you need to remember, which is Q. So you select the object that you want to paint with, you select the target, and then you just paint. This is using the geometry nodes hair system, so you can use the original brushes to manipulate your instances, so you can scale, slide, and rotate in order to art-direct your scene. Now, if you press Q with just one object selected, you're going to go into draw mode, but we're gonna go back to that later because there's a lot to explain. Now, while you're painting with something, you can press Q on another surface in order to paint on top of multiple surfaces at once, which by the way also works on rigged characters. Now, another very important feature is the ability to turn on the procedural distribution, which basically allows you to distribute your mesh using noise patterns across the entire surface. One of the main features of this add-on is the ability of converting from procedural to manually editable hair. So once you fine-tune the paint settings, which we'll go through in a bit, you can press Q and convert it in order to shift around, move, scale, and rotate your instances. This is important because procedural distribution will only get you so far. You need to be able to manually art-direct your scenes. So you can have a first pass of procedurally distributed objects, then refine everything by hand. Or of course, just paint everything by hand from the start. This is non-destructive, meaning that you can go back and forth from procedural to manual, change your settings, and convert once again. Also, to jump back into paint mode, you can just select the paint system and press Q. This is important because you will basically update the density of the brush based on the size of the actual object. Additionally, while you're painting, you can also press Q on any other paint system in order to switch to that one and just keep painting between systems and objects and surfaces. Now, while I'm painting with an asset, I often wonder if a similar asset might be a better fit. So I created the ability to switch brush object with just Shift Q in order to quickly experiment and see which asset looks best. So with the paint system selected, or even while painting, you can just spam the shortcut over any other object in order to switch it. Another important feature is the ability to paint from the asset library. So everything I just showed you so far also works from the asset library itself. So with the surface target selected, you can select another object and press Q right from the library. Then you can Shift Q just like we did before in order to iterate with different objects. Now everything gets imported next to the terrain you selected, but you can also click this button so that everything ends up into a hidden collection. Now, all the assets that you're importing this way end up in the current file section of the asset library, so you can keep referencing the same object or collection imported earlier, instead of re-importing the same object over and over again. In a bit, I'm going to show you how to create this biome in particular, but let's say that you have your own biome, that you painted everything that you wanted to paint and imported every object. Now, if you want to assign this onto another surface, all you need to do is select the entire biome, which you can do either manually or by clicking this button. Select the new surface and press Q, and the entire biome and all of its content will be procedurally assigned onto the other surface. Again, everything is as intuitive as possible. The shortcut Q is going to adapt based on what you selected in the scene. Then it's also important to remember that you can save your biome, so you can select all the content of the biome, or even from the panel itself, needs to be from the same surface. So once everything is selected, in the utilities you can give it a name, choose the path where you want to save the blend file, and just export it. It will immediately show up in the asset library, and then of course from there you'll be able to import it into any other scene by selecting the surface mesh, pressing Q from the library, and the biome is imported exactly as it was. Or you can do that manually by importing it. Make sure that you uncheck instance, and from here you just have to select the biomes just like before, select the target and press Q. And the biome is imported exactly as you saved it. I should also mention that you can use this to export regular assets as well. So if you want to export this cone and then this icosphere, you'll notice that they will both appear in the blend file that you specified to export to, alongside the biome that we exported earlier. Let's go through the modifier, which is pretty straightforward, but there are a few things that I want to mention. So the spread and noise essentially control the noise pattern that is distributing the instances. The slope and height masks simply control where the instances are appearing, so the slope is pretty self-explanatory, and the height as well. You can have these masks separate from one another, or you can combine them. This is especially useful in a scenario where you have, let's say, a mountain and some trees, because you can have the slope mask to avoid the trees growing on the mountainside, and then the mask to avoid the trees from growing at the bottom or something like that. You get the point. Another useful function is to align the rotation to the z-axis. You can also unlock more settings from this box, which will essentially unlock a few more options in the modifiers, but in the overwhelming amount of situations you are not going to need the advanced modifier, so you can just turn it on and off. You get a few more masks that you might want to work with, individual scale, and also wind. The wind is pretty easy and straightforward. You just enable the strength and you change the scale and the speed. Let's talk about the draw functionality. It basically works by having just one object selected, pressing Q and just drawing in 3D. You can use this feature to draw and sculpt interesting shapes. I like to use objects like bones or ornaments in order to create interesting patterns. You can also use the mean radius and mean tilt in order to change the appearance of the curve. As a reminder, you can also use Shift Q in order to test different objects and to see how they look with the curve that you're trying to draw. Also keep in mind that you can turn on the mirror in order to create interesting patterns even quicker. You can also, while drawing, select a curve and press Alt Q in order to separate it into its own object. So now you can change the settings in the modifier or even switch the object itself in order to create variation in your curve. While you're drawing with an object, you can also create a circle in order to create essentially circular arrays. Now, if you then animate a few of the settings in the modifier, you can quickly see how I basically created my flowers from my animations. This technique doesn't just work for plants, but on sci-fi structures as well. In this renderer, I created these structures with some sci-fi panels, and you can see how easy it is to quickly iterate by switching brush objects, tilting the curve, scaling, and just drawing around the scene. So here's another use case. I basically use the draw functionality to cover this character in order to create essentially an armor. And again, everything I just showed you so far applies as well. So you can very easily just shift around the curve and test different things very, very quickly. And in the future, I'm also going to add the possibility to rig these curves into the rig of the character itself. I should also mention that there are 3 types of curve, and they all behave a little bit differently. You switch between them from this switch in the modifier, and basically the first one simply adapts to the length of the curve itself. The second one depends on the resolution of the curve itself, which means that you can control the density by simply subdividing wherever you want the curve to be more dense. The third one is very straightforward. It's just a certain number of instances. So, for example, if you set it to this type of curve, number 3, you can set the exact number of instances that you want to appear. This is especially useful in architecture whenever you're trying to create a building that has a specific number of faces, but we'll return to this later. Now let's go through the main panel. We already covered the paint and switch functionalities, so let's see what the rest of the buttons are doing. The Realize Instances button is pretty straightforward. When you have a paint system, it's essentially an entire object on its own. You can go to edit mode in order to manually change and switch around the instances, but it's kind of limited. So if you want, you can realize instances, and now these are essentially separate objects on their own. Keep in mind that this is non-destructive, so you can notice that if I move this over, the original paint system is still there. So you can manipulate the instances just like before and then realize instances again if you want. But there's another use case for this button. Essentially, if you have a rock as a paint system and then you want to paint with some grass, you notice that the grass is going through the original rocks, and that's because these are two separate objects. So if you want, you can realize the instances for the rocks. So now while you're painting with any other object, you can press Q on the rocks just like with any other surface. So you can paint on top. The group button is pretty straightforward as well. You can simply group objects into the same collection. It also works from the outliner, and I essentially replaced the shortcut M for this because I never wanted to go through that annoying dialog box, and I just wanted to quickly group objects. The next couple of buttons are part of another huge feature of this add-on. As you might have noticed, working with collection instances in Blender is extremely unoptimized, inefficient, and annoying in general, and that's because you have to put everything in the world origin, and if you want to move its content, everything in your scene is going to break apart. But with my add-on, you can move the content of the collection and then recenter it. So again, you can group everything together with this button. You can create an instance of the collection with this button, and then you can recenter that collection. There are two main use cases for this. The first is being able to paint with assemblies of objects that can't regularly be joined together. So if I want, I can add some lights or any other simulation or particle system or whatever I want that can't usually be joined into a single mesh. The second use case is modeling architecture, because this allows you to very efficiently put together procedural structures like this tower. I just put all these objects together in the same collection, and then through collection instances I can now procedurally edit the entire structure. So again, all I did was put everything in the same collection, then instance it, and then with Q just drawing with it. But instead of just drawing, I added a circle just as I showed you before. By the way, there's also a shortcut in here to create circular arrays. So if you combine all the techniques I showed you so far, you can see how easy it is to put together huge structures like this. You can switch ornament to find the best one. You can paint moss on top of anything, while essentially having the collection instances taking care of everything else. Let's quickly talk about the reproject button. So let's say that you're painting on top of a mesh, but you know that you're going to resculpt that mesh. The procedural systems will update automatically, of course, but the manual paint will stay exactly where you painted it, of course. So you can just click this button in order to reproject it, so you can then keep painting. This also reprojects the UVs on top of the original base mesh, because the geometry hair system needs correct UVs in order to paint hair. Now let's talk about one of the biggest features of this add-on, which is the viewport mask. So Blender basically has two bottlenecks. Number one, the amount of geometry that's displaying on the screen. The second one is the amount of objects that you're displaying. So for the first problem, the geometry, you can use the box view, which is pretty efficient at preserving performances, but even then when you're painting with a lot of objects, Blender will slow down immediately. and it will be impossible to even just select objects, which is why I came up with this viewport mask system, which basically allows you to maintain the viewport performance by just working on one section of your scene at a time. This is huge for me because previously I had to disable the whole biome in the viewport and wait for it to render the whole thing just to see how it looks. This way you can literally art direct your scene in real time. I should also mention that if you're bringing your biome into a huge terrain, the mask will be triggered automatically just so your computer doesn't explode. The rest of the panel buttons are self-explanatory as well. There's a button to turn on and off the system. There are arrows to change the biome grouping, which is just for organization purposes. For example, I know that all my trees are in this biome and all the small foliage is in the other one. This way I can quickly select the biome or change the settings all at once. And finally, there's a button for weight painting. So you can select multiple hair from the surface and paint all of them at once by pressing Q, or you can do that by using the panel. You can also alt-click if you want to remove it, and as before, you can click this button or Q in the viewport to apply to manual hair, and of course go back to procedural whenever you want. The weight paint is especially useful when you basically want multiple biomes on top of the same surface. So you want the forest to appear in one area, then some other foliage to, I don't know, define a path in the woods, and yeah, that's the best workflow to achieve that. So again, you can shift click to change the selection, and you can also alt click in order to basically create a duplicate of that paint system. I use this a lot whenever I want to experiment around and I just want to create a very quick backup so that if I want, I can just go back to the previous version. This also works with biomes. So you can alt-click a biome in order to have a duplicate that you can go back to. Now that's pretty much it, but I still wanted to go through a few extra utilities that might come in handy. So let's say that you're painting a tree on top of a mountain and you change the settings in order to have the look that you're going for. Now if you wanted to paint another tree, you would have to modify those settings again. So instead of selecting the terrain, select the existing paint system. Now, when you press Q, you will inherit all the modifier settings of the paint system you originally selected, including slope masks and everything else. Another tip, if you have a lot of similar objects that you want to paint at once, you can group them together in the same collection, select it, select the target mesh and press Q. Now the paint system will basically pick a random instance from that collection. I also wanted to encourage you to use the linked import settings, and that's because normally you can't move the object or you can't change its material, but with my add-on you can. By the way, if you're just trying to import something from the asset library without painting, just use Alt-Q. So this will save a lot of performance and storage by only having the mesh data linked, while everything else is local, like the material and the object itself. I also added the shortcut X in order to switch the weight paint from 0 to 1, just like you would in Photoshop. I just thought that this should have been in Blender by default, but there you go. Another button that I haven't explained yet is the shared material. So let's say that you have a biome with all these rocks and you want to change the color or the roughness of all these meshes all at once. You can just press this button and it will basically add a node group in front of every PBR shader in every material, in every object you selected. So now you can change the look of everything all at once. And of course, you can just click the button again in order to remove it or change the ID in order to have different versions for different assets. I also wanted to remind you that the tooltips are very detailed, so if you're ever confused, just hover with your mouse in order to see the explanation of each of the buttons. One final tip, let's say that you've been painting with the same object across a lot of different surfaces. Now, if you want to change the settings of that particular asset, you basically have to do that manually for each paint system. But if you Control-Alt-Click, you'll basically select all the paint system that have a similar brush object. So from there, you just have to Alt-Click in the modifier in order to change the same settings across the entire scene. Alright, so now I'm going to recreate these biomes in order to show you exactly what workflow I use in order to create a procedural set of environments. I'm also going to recreate the forest afterwards. So first of all, I simply sculpted this shape from a random sphere. I simply enabled dynamic topology in order to shape it however I want. Then I just assigned a moss material, which is also box projected instead of using the UVs. But to be completely honest, the base material doesn't really matter because it's going to be completely covered with naturalistic assets. Okay, so first of all, I like to search for good reference in order to have a basic idea and understanding of what a real life environment would look like, and also to make a very basic list of all the objects and assets that I would have to recreate. So I made these assets that you see from scratch, except maybe this grass, but it's pretty straightforward. For the comments, these are just alpha textures on a plane. Same for the fern. I simply photographed a fern in my garden and then cut it out with Photoshop, and then this is just some moss and some clovers. So I will start right away from the fern. So I select the fern, select the target, press Q, and instead of painting I will switch right away to the procedural distribution. From there I will tweak the settings until I find something that I like. Same thing for the clovers, so I press Q and switch to procedural right away. Now because these are very small, they're gonna slow down the scene quite a lot, so I'm gonna turn on the box view right away. I'm gonna play with the noise a little bit. Now for the decumbents, I used a slope mask in order to make them grow only at the bottom of the base mesh. Then I align them to the global Z. Now the next decumbent, instead of starting from scratch, I will select the other decumbent that I just set up in order to just press Q and have these new decumbents with the same exact settings of the other one, instead of having to start from scratch. I will turn on the box view for these as well. Now for the moss. Now this is going to be extremely dense and it's gonna cover the entire surface, so I'm gonna put the spread at 100% and then I'm gonna play with the density until the entire surface is covered. I will also turn on the box view, of course. And now for the last asset, the grass. Again, I'm gonna target the moss instead of the surface in order to just copy the settings. And now this, instead of being 100%, I'm gonna have it at 50 so that it's not gonna appear on the entire surface. I'm gonna play with the size and the density a little bit. Keep in mind that the density is gonna be calculated based on the size of the object that you're painting with. But of course you can change it manually and fine-tune it. And that's it. It's pretty straightforward. And now I have a procedural biome that will adapt automatically based on the surface. Now let's recreate the forest. So I usually like to start from the biggest assets that I'm going to paint with. So in this case, let's start from the trees. I have a few trees that are very similar, so I'm gonna put them in the same collection and then press Q on the surface. The procedural distribution, of course, tweak the settings a little bit. I'm also going to make the terrain a little bit bigger. Same thing with the smaller trees. I'm gonna put all of these in the same sub-collection and then pressing Q on the surface. I'm actually going to increase the density but decrease the spread so that I have essentially patches of trees all around. At this point I can start to paint with smaller assets. So let's start with these smaller trees. Same thing as before, I'm gonna put them in a sub-collection, press Q. Turn on procedural. Now that I'm happy with these assets, I'm okay with turning on the box view. Now I have a collection of logs and stumps. Same thing as before, put them in a sub-collection, press Q, turn on procedural, and fine-tune the settings. Same thing with the ferns, subgroup, Q, procedural, change the settings. Another very important setting that you might want to play with is the scale randomness, because you can have a randomness for each instance, but the world scale randomness essentially has this very unique way to essentially have an entire patch of assets being scaled up or down based on their world location. So this helps break up the repetition even more. Same thing with these smaller twigs, but instead of selecting the terrain, I'm going to select the previous ferns and tweak everything from there. Turning on the box view for performance. Now we're starting to paint with a very small asset. So as you can see, the viewport is lagging a lot. I cannot even select an object. So in this case, not only I'm going to turn on the box view right away, but I'm also going to turn on the mask, which will allow me to still work on the viewport and preview the paint settings and everything else in real time without having to render. Also keep in mind that the procedural distribution needs a little bit of geometry to work with. Unfortunately, that's a limitation of geometry nodes. You cannot use noise textures that are not dependent on the topology. So if you subdivide the plane a little bit, you will get a much finer result. I'm actually going to go back to the ferns and maybe put them on 100%. At this point, we're getting into the extremely small assets, so again, I'm going to turn on the box view and the mask even before turning on the procedural distribution. And these details are very, very fine, so you can only really notice them if you're going up close the surface, but I still find that it's good practice to add as much of these details as possible. And lastly, the pebbles, same thing as before. Press Q, turn on the mask right away, and the procedural distribution. So now I can just preview it in real time, and just like that I have an entire biome that I can now select, save in my asset library, and then re-import in any project at any time. From here, as I showed you before, I usually like to categorize my assets by just putting them in different biomes. And of course, from here you can customize your scene by switching to manual mode from procedural in order to art direct it and making sure that you can actually control how the biome is looking. Lastly, I just wanted to mention a few limitations of this workflow. So first of all, when you're painting on top of another surface, that surface ideally should have the same exact scale for each of the three axes. So it's okay for it to be bigger or smaller, but it should not be scaled on one axis only. I should be able to resolve that for future versions, but for now, just keep in mind that it's good practice to apply the scale before painting. The second limitation has to do with the geometry hair system. So it basically really starts to slow down whenever you're painting on top of a surface that has more than 60,000 polygons, or if you're painting on top of a surface that doesn't have correct UVs. Unfortunately, I cannot solve that. That's up to Blender, but I just thought I should mention it. In conclusion, I really built this workflow to be iterative, non-destructive, and to quickly test different versions of the same scene. So ever since I came up with this workflow a couple of years ago, it completely changed the way that I build environments. And, I've been refining it as much as possible. So I'm very excited to finally release it. So feel free to DM me with some feature requests or bug reports, or even to just show me what you create with it. So any feedback is appreciated. I also have a lot of ideas and features that I'm going to add in the future, so you can look forward to that, as well as some complete biome asset packs with pre-made scenes and all that stuff. So that's it.